and his little cubs are pulling in vain at his sleeves. He goes and has his head shaved, as you see here. So there is the pointy-nosed tanuki having the top of his head shaved so that he can be a Buddhist monk. There is a nice color, a scene, and again, throughout this emaki, it is the same technique that John was telling us about, the ji dozu, different times in the same different times in the same picture. There he says goodbye to his wife and children, and then there he is walking away and looking back toward the burrow one last time. The goodbye scene, this is from a very famous emaki of the 13th century, the story of the priest Saigyo, who was originally a samurai. When he went home for the last time after he'd decided to become a Buddhist monk, his little daughter ran out to meet him and he kicked her off the veranda, which is dreadful by modern standards, but it shows that his dedication to religion overcame everything, even fatherly love. So in the end, the tanuki joins the Pure Land sect, which calls on the name of Amida Buddha. He does a particular type of nembutsu called the odori nembutsu, the dancing nembutsu. And so he dances and sings, and he does what tanuki do and plays on the belly drum. So there, it's very appropriate for him. And this is the final scene, which you can see beautifully upstairs. There's a lovely winter landscape, and he is in his little retreat, but still composing poetry. And there's here is the scene where his head is being shaven. Unfortunately, you can't quite see the tanuki, but there he is dancing. Now, there are very complicated arguments about when this was made, which I don't really have time to go into. However, I'll try to summarize this as quickly as possible. The calligraphers of the first scroll and the second and third scroll have been identified as Gosuko-in, and this part is quite definite. This is definitely the person who did the calligraphy on the first of those 15th century scrolls in the Kyoto National Museum. We even know about when he did it because the first draft has been found, and we can date it to about 1451. Now, according to these traditional attributions, the calligrapher of the second and third scrolls is Prince Sondo. However, this has not been extensively studied. The Japanese commentators who have studied the scroll have assumed that the whole thing must have been made by Gosuko-in. The problem with that is, if you look at his diary, he mentions that there was an emaki that belonged to the shogun that he borrowed. And then, unfortunately, we don't have his diary for 1451, but then he eventually, it seems, copied it. To make a long story short, I think that the present version that is in Kyoto is actually pieces of two sets that have been put together. I think the first scroll was made by Gosuko-in in 1451, but that it was copied from an older one. I think that Sondo was the calligrapher and probably was the author also, in which case it must have been made before his death in 1403. Now, who was the patron that he made it for? Well, I strongly suspect Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third of the Ashikaga shoguns. I think perhaps that is who is represented by the dragon. He's known for his patronage of Zen Buddhism, and he had a fabulous palace, of which one building survives, the Golden Pavilion, or at least it survived until 1950 when it was burned by an arsonist in what you see now as a replacement. But he had a very lavish lifestyle. He actually retired from the shogunate in 1394 and made his young son Yoshimochi the shogun, but he lived very much in the style of a retired emperor. Some people even suspect that his favorite son, Yoshitsugu, remember the dragon had two sons? Some people think that Yoshimitsu was planning to make his younger favorite son the actual emperor of Japan. Because in 1408, when this young man came of age, his father gave him a coming-of-age party that was just like the party that would be done for an imperial prince. very suspicious. However, Yoshimitsu died, and the older son, who was the shogun, didn't like that little brat one bit, and eventually got rid of him in 1418. So if that was what Yoshimitsu had in mind, it didn't come off. Now, the Dragon Association, one of the things that makes people think that Yoshimitsu may have been trying to supplant the imperial family is that he succeeded in getting the Ming dynasty to recognize him as, quote, King of Japan, unquote, Nihon Kokuo. He first got this recognition in 1402, and then he continued to have friendly correspondence with the third Ming emperor, the Emperor Yongle. And one of the diplomatic gifts sent to Yoshimitsu was dragon robes. I show you, there is the Yongle Emperor in his yellow-on-yellow dragon robe with the dragon medallion there, and here is just to show you what the dragon would look like. That's a 19th century imperial robe in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And let's see, what is a good point? I show you my dragon tights, which I'm wearing today in honor of Yoshimitsu's dragon robes. Now, if he's the dragon, who's the tanuki? We're looking for someone who is a warrior, a poet, a Buddhist priest, and the survivor of an unsuccessful rebellion. There is such a person. He's Imagawa Ryoshun. The actual rebel in the so-called Oe Rebellion, the rebellion of the year Oe 6, which is 1399, or moving into the very beginning of 1400 in the Western calendar. The person behind the rebellion was Ouchi Yoshihiro. He was killed in the fighting. I think we can identify him with the kite. Ryoshun survived, and it's not clear whether he was really involved in the rebellion or not. He claimed that he was not. He actually wrote a kind of essay that came out in 1402 criticizing the Taiheki. The Taiheki is the war story of the civil wars in the 14th century. He felt that his ancestors had been slandered in that, and that he himself had been slandered and was not really a rebel. And either because of this or because of his family connections, he got off. He lived the rest of his life in retirement. What happened? The city of Sakai, remember the Tanuki's burrow is in Sakai? There's only one time in Japanese history when there has been fighting in Sakai, and this was it. So I think that's a very strong clue. Sondo, who may have been the calligrapher of Scrolls 2 and 3, was involved in this. Because he was a neutral Buddhist priest, he was sent by the shogun to ask the retired shogun who was running things behind the scenes, to ask the rebel to surrender. And then, as a poet himself, he, I suspect, probably had a lot of contempt for Imagawa Ryoshun. There's a certain amount of envy and just general dislike. The whole vision of Yoshimitsu as a dragon may have had to do with the fact that it was in the 8th month of 1402 that he first got that title, King of Japan. But if we credit this to Sondo, it has to have been done before the 5th month of 1403, when he died. So here are some possible correspondences. That's one more. The Deer, a well-known poet of the 14th century, who basically had a foot in both camps. He was a friend of both the shogun Yoshimitsu and of Imagawa Ryoshun. So I can't prove any of this, but I think it's very suggestive. Where did such an idea come from of writing a political satire with animals in human form? Well, I'm sure one inspiration was the very, very famous scroll of frolicking animals. And I think another source of inspiration was esoteric Buddhist drawings showing the animals as guardian figures actually wearing armor. But I think the whole thing was extremely clever. It leads us to the question of why animal stories in general. Now, one interpretation of the Frolicking Animal Scrolls is that the idea originated with the commoners of Kyoto, and that they were satirizing the aristocracy and the athletic matches that the aristocrats enjoyed by comparing them to animals. Similarly, in the case of the Battles of the 12 Animals, the scholars who think that Gosuko-in was behind it feel that he, as a member of the imperial family, was mocking the warriors by comparing them to animals. What I think, however, is that it was one group of warriors who are represented by the 12 animals, the winners, who are mocking another group represented by the Tanuki and his faction. So that is my interpretation of it. Now, I think there was so much going on in the 15th century that the Oe rebellion was quickly forgotten. I think that by the time this scroll became popular in the Edo period, that allegorical meaning was completely gone. I think it was so well done that it was enjoyed in later centuries for its own sake and had even transcended the circumstances of its original creation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Masako Watanabe, for organizing a wonderful show that is so rewarding, and I hope all of you go back if you haven't seen it yet. So let's now dive literally into another exciting story that is full of fantasies, exoticisms, valor, and juicy love affairs. While introducing the narrative, I will address 3 points. The first is the different pictorial formats on which the story is depicted and their physical relationship to the viewer. And we are lucky that we have a number of different formats in the galleries upstairs. And then second, the diverging visual interpretations of the narrative according to the different formats and also according to individual works. And then the third point is the reasons why this narrative was so popular in the 17th century. The title of the story, Taishokan, refers to an honorary title that was given to the aristocrat Fujiwara Kamatari of the 7th century. So that's 1,000 years earlier than the 17th century. Taishokan was the founder and ancestral deity of the powerful Fujiwara family, which continued to thrive for centuries. It is this very fact that he's the originator of this Fujiwara house, which caters to the success of the story, one of the many reasons. Taishokan was depicted in countless extant portraits, and on the left-hand side you see one that is very typical of the 16th century, and he was venerated in public as well as in private spaces, and you can see on the upper right in the Tonomine shrine in Nara that this veneration continues until today. So in this portrait on the left-hand side, you see Taishokan in a kind of very stately figure with his 2 sons. One son is in a monk's garb, and the other one looks like a miniature version of his. And in fact, the Taishokan story that we are engaging in the coming 20 minutes or 25 is conflated with Taishokan. So these two are one, and the succession of the family is recounted through the grandson of Kamatari or Taishokan, or the son of Fushito, the Taishokan's son. So let me start by recounting the narrative using the images of one of the scrolls, sets of scrolls that are upstairs. This is one of at least 20 Taishokan hand scrolls that I was able to trace so far. It belongs to the Burke Foundation in this city. One other version resides in the New York Public Library, and that is also on show upstairs. As you can see from the scrolls, they are about 30 centimeters high or 33 centimeters high, and you actually need to handle them. You can manipulate them, you can unroll as much as you want or go back, and you can find your own rhythm of reading, which is not possible as a museum visitor, unfortunately. So I want you to keep in mind that this physical relationship to the actual artifact in the galleries is quite different to what it was when they were created.